Welcome to Best Wellness Interviews, where I interview successful people and they share their experiences around wellness and their strategies of how they change their life. And I'm Kristine Best, I am your host, and today my guest is Grace King. She is from Florida in the US. Welcome to my show, Grace.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And I would like you to just give a brief background as to why y you are on the journey that you're on, who you are, what you do, just briefly, and then we'll get into more detailed stuff.
Okay. So I've been on an 8-year journey. 8 years ago, I had a doctor perform medical malpractice on me and he scrambled my brain. And it took me years to actually recover. I was, it was, well, I woke up the next day and I was really, the medical term would be schizophrenia. Woke up schizophrenic within 24 hours, but it was more of a psychosis type medical problem. But I had doctors tell me that I would not recover and that it was not possible to recover because I had been injected with 7 cortisone steroid injections, and you're not supposed to have more than two in a year. And he scrambled my brain overnight. And so I was on a desperate attempt to find reality and to find myself. And during that time, I found God, and God started communicating with me supernaturally. And He was letting me know that if I followed Him and if I was obedient, that my brain would heal. So the last 8 years have been a combination of doctors, God, and my healing journey to recovery.
That must have been scary because I believe you didn't know who you were, you didn't know your name.
No.
So tell us how you felt inside so that people can understand the trauma that you.
Yeah. When I woke up the next day, I didn't really understand what was going on. I just felt very euphoric and everything was connected. Everything had a meaning. Everything, it felt like my brain was in knots and I couldn't think. So when I would go to try to say something, my words were jumbled up. I talked really fast, and I just remember feeling fear and terror, and as if everything had a meaning. And I don't really know how to explain it other than that. It was terrifying.
So is it
I
kind of,
thought I was 30 years in the future. Um,
you say you felt disjointed?
I'm sorry.
Would you say you felt disjointed?
Yeah. Yeah. I just, reality snapped. I wasn't even in reality. I thought I was 30 years in the future. I do remember having this really strong presence of God all around me. And I knew that He was everywhere. And I couldn't really escape it. And I remember trying to feel like I wanted to run from Him. And I remember I ended up my family took me in and they brought me to a doctor, and the doctors, they kept me for a while, and they told my family, they said, she may never come out of this. This is severe. They didn't know what had happened to me. They didn't know it was cortisone steroid injections. I didn't know at the time that that's what caused it. I had had a stroke 8 months prior to that and a previous head trauma. And so my brain was very fragile. And it didn't take when they gave me the injections, it was like brain on fire. And it was scrambled, completely scrambled, and I couldn't form thoughts, and I couldn't. Thinking was off. My awareness was off. I remember feeling like I was trapped in a bubble, and like my eyesight, my vision was messed up, and I didn't think I was going to survive it, to be honest. I almost didn't survive the stroke 8 months prior. And then the reason that I had to have the injections was for drop foot. It's something that happens after a stroke. People can get drop foot in their feet, and that's what happened to me. And so the doctor had to give me cortisone shots. But the guy that did it, he overdosed me on it. And so my brain was so fragile, it just couldn't withstand the injections. And then that's when, around the same time as I was visiting with doctors with my family, God is the one who started showing up and giving me visions and giving me supernatural help and letting me know that if I followed him and was obedient, that my brain would start to heal. And I don't know how much, I know every people that are listening, that we all have our own belief systems, and but I was very spiritual back then, and I was a Christian, but I wasn't a practicing Christian, I would say. So I did not understand. I didn't really understand Christianity at the time, and so he had to teach me a lot in order for me to become obedient and to listen to his words and to listen to Christ's teachings. And once I understood that I was in darkness and that the brain deteriorates in darkness, I was able to understand that I needed to find the light. And that meant by implementing the teachings of Jesus. And by doing so, the brain would heal. And I had no idea how fast it could happen. And it took me a little time. I didn't implement every teaching right away. I kind of cherry picked. I was like, oh, well, this one sounds good and I can do this one. And, but when it really came down to some of the difficult ones, like forgiveness, I'm sure there's other people out there that have had past hurts and trauma, and sometimes those can be hard to forgive and to love people unconditionally. And so, but I remember once I did implement them and it was real, my brain lit up, and I started to heal dramatically overnight in ways that are so profound that I told my doctors couldn't believe it. They didn't understand. And I told them, it's obedience. I'm like, God's been trying to get through to me. He told me he designed the brain. If I would just listen to him, I would heal. And it's really that simple. And I couldn't, I look back on it now and I'm like, it all sounds so simple, but it took me 8 years of trial and error, because obedience doesn't come easy to us. It's not in our nature to follow rules and or teachings like that. And so for me, I saw some really profound results. And I think that the world needs to know that the brain can heal, and the brain does heal. But as far as being 100% healed, I wouldn't say that, because, like you and I discussed earlier, I mean, we aren't able to be perfect. And that is, why we have Jesus, and he's perfect. But if we follow his teachings, the brain can heal in a way that, even though I still have to take medication, I know I'm in reality and I'm able to take care of my children and go back to work and have a functioning life. And before, I was completely, completely unable to do so. So,
Yeah. So that would have been very traumatic experience, not being able to like care for yourself or even put your thoughts together to be understood. And
Right. And that was the hardest thing was communication.
yeah, yeah. And your parents, you said they took you in, yeah.
Yes, I did.
So
I lived with them for 3 years.
right, and they must have been pretty amazing parents to care for you, because that you would have needed constant care at that point.
Yes, it was a
So
lot.
yeah, so have you spoken to your parents? Tell me a little bit about that relationship and how you are with them now.
Great. They're wonderful. They were a big part of my support. They were my support system in the beginning, and we went the medical route, from the get go with doctors and medicines, and I had to be put on a lot of medication just to try to find stability in my brain. The goal was to slow it down. My brain was operating at such a fast speed that they needed to slow it down in order for me to find some kind of stability on medication. But the side effects were awful and they were scary. And I had panic attacks and fear at night. I couldn't sleep. My sleep and wake cycles are completely destroyed. So that's the reason I'm still on medication today, is because my brain does not shut down or start up on its own. So I have to be put down at night and then woken up in the morning. But as far as every day, the journey, my parents, they were a big support whenever I decided to move back to Florida and be with my children and go back to work. And at the same time, I was on my journey with God. And so I was starting to see results through obedience. And I was starting to see that my brain was starting to come back to life. And my mom was a big support system with that journey as well. And she kind of found her way back to Christ, during this time as well, because she saw the results that I was having. And I guess you would have had to have seen the shape I was in prior to where I am today to understand the magnitude of the kind of healing that I've experienced. But my mom saw it firsthand, and my family, they at first they thought I was crazy. They were just like, "You're on some crazy journey." And I said, "You don't know." I said, "I'm receiving visions from God and intuitive guidance." And I said, "I'm going to follow God because the doctors can't fix me. And if the doctors can't fix me, the only person that can fix me is the one who designed the brain. And I'm going to go with him." And I did. And so it's been 8 years, and I kind of buckled down, and I just, like I said, I've kept journals and documentation, and I've had brain scans, and I went from doctors telling me my brain looked like an 80-year-old woman to a healthy 43-year-old woman. And that was, over the course of years of work with the Lord, and implementing Christ's teachings. I can't emphasize that enough. Like that obedience really does bring the brain back. And of course, it won't be perfect because we aren't capable of being perfect, but there is the kind of healing that, I mean, I shouldn't be here talking or able to have a rational conversation. The shape I was in was absolutely devastating. So,
So what do the doctors say about that?
well, I have a neurologist that I go to, and a psychiatrist that I see as well. And they both are just blown away.
Yeah, they can't explain it, right? Miracle.
No, they
Yep.
think it's like this poof instant miracle, and it wasn't an instant miracle. It was a gradual, little miracles at a time through obedience. And I mean, I really, I can't. It was so crazy because I remember reading through my Bible, looking for answers because God had given me visions. And I said, I thought to myself, the answers have to be biblical. They have to be in the Bible. And when I started reading through the New Testament and I really started studying scripture and just dove into biblical doctrine, I couldn't get my hands on enough information. And I started piecing the puzzle together. And with God's help, of course, he he stuck by me through everything. I mean, I used to have seizures, and I remember one time I was on a bridge and I was trying to drive and I had a really bad seizure and a bright pink star showed up in front of my car and stayed with me until I got off the bridge. So God was kind of like my caretaker during those years also. My family was there for me, but God was there for me spiritually, and he was there for me to help me repair the brain from scratch. And I didn't know he could rebuild a brain. I kind of joke with them and I'm just like, I'm like, yeah, you did it from scratch. Like I was completely shot. Like my brain didn't have stand a chance. And little by little through implementing, and putting into practice all the things that Jesus says to do, my brain came back. So,
When you give your body the right circumstances, it will heal itself. God designed it to heal itself, but people don't often give it, well, they usually don't give it the best circumstances, right? You've given yourself the right circumstances to heal yourself. Well, God healed you, I guess, yeah, but you also took the steps to allow that to happen. So, you have to take action, right? And people
right.
have to action if they want to
Absolutely.
move forward in life. You can't just sit there and do nothing, right?
Right. No, that wasn't an option for me.
Yeah.
I was too young when it happened. I was 35 when it happened, and I'm 43 now. And I just, playing the victim wasn't an option. I didn't want to be the victim. I didn't want to take disability. I didn't want to quit on my kids. I didn't want to quit on my career. I still was with it on the inside enough to have a little bit of fight in me to where I wanted to fight for it and I wanted to fight and find my way back to reality. It was it was hard. It was one of the hardest things I ever did. And I feel like I had to learn how to master psychosis. And that was like the first step. And that was really hard because I had to learn it and understand it. And then I had to be able to place it into categories, like what is darkness? What is being in the light? What does that mean? And when you can kind of place things in these two categories, um, for me, it made all the sense in the world and to understand the brain, with darkness and light, because the brain really does deteriorate in darkness and in the light it thrives. So, but you do have to take action and you do have to move forward and you can't have a victim mentality. You have to want to heal. But for me, it was really obedience. And that's what brought my brain back.
Yeah. So you're talking about it deep within you, there was this fight, you wanted it, right? But then there's the spiritual side, and that kind of tells you don't necessarily have to fight. All you have to do is follow what God says to do, right?
Right.
So in a way, it's not the fight, but you still had to have enough fight to take the steps on the journey. I can
Right.
imagine it's easy.
I feel like biblically, the Bible is like a blueprint for healthy living.
Mhm.
And, when we dive deep into it and try to understand what Jesus is trying to teach us, for me, I learned that not only does God restore people on the outside and on our hearts, but he can restore the mind. He can, he does just spending time with him in general. There's a lot of healing that can take place in a person. Um, but I personally feel the Bible is like a blueprint, is for health, for healthy mind, body, soul kind of thing.
Mm.
And I feel like I really had to dig deep to understand where I'm at with it.
Well, see,
It didn't happen overnight. It was about an 8-year journey,
yeah,
but and a lot of research. But I do find that it's very helpful if we do apply it to our daily lives.
you know, well, as a human being, we are not just, um, say, nutrition, you know, nutrition and exercise. There's more to the human being that it needs, and that's the social life and the spiritual life. And a lot of people neglect the spiritual life.
Right.
And one spirituality is part of who you are, and that's the missing piece in a lot of people's lives. And
Right.
I think a lot of people have a lot of unrest. That they're just not settled in life. They're looking for that one thing that's going to make them happy and fulfill their life, and they can't
Absolutely.
find it.
So the next
And
thing that,
the missing piece is,
right.
what is
Right.
it?
No, I mean, I agree with you. It's people are always looking, oh, well, this will make me happy. And then they go out and they achieve it, and then they're not happy. And then
But
they're on to the next thing. So the spiritual side, is, I used to say that we're these spiritual beings living on a planet spinning in the middle of the universe. And I feel like now that I know God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, I can honestly tell you they are like family. And it's almost like how would anybody want to be on this planet? It's like going out on a boat without your tour guide. If you're on a if you go on a on a boat ride, or you're going somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you have a tour guide, how that's no different than Earth, right? Than this planet. Like, why would we come here without God to help us along the journey? Because I have found that the experience with God has been so beautiful, and his ways are so beautiful, and I don't even look at the world the same way anymore. So he's like the missing component, in my opinion.
exactly, exactly. And I think that is a concept that people have a hard time getting their head around because it is
Right.
difficult.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say, I've looked for God and I can't find him. And I remember thinking, back when I was spiritual, I remember thinking about that, and I said, well, for me, God wasn't hard to find at all. But we have to look in the right places, right? Like, for me, as soon as I started researching Jesus, it was like God showed up very quickly.
Mm.
And I told somebody, I said, I feel like he's with Jesus. God is with Jesus. And if you want to find God, look for Jesus. It's really simple. And because the Trinity sticks together. And that's hard for some people because they want to put God in a box, or they want to be spiritual, and they want to believe in energy and vibrations and frequencies and all these spiritual terms. And that's all great. And that's a lot of that is God. But the journey for me was more spiritual whenever I started researching God and trying to understand him and trying to understand his ways and what he wants for this planet and what he wants for each one of us and how much he loves us. Like, I can't express the kind of love that God has for humans. Like, I mean, he just dove in to help me when I had a serious crisis and a really bad trauma. And he didn't stop. he didn't stop helping me one bit. So, but we have to not have distractions in our life. And I was fortunate that I didn't have any distractions at the time because my brain completely malfunctioned on me. But I do tell people all the time, if you want to have a close relationship, just detach from the world. Stop watching so much TV. Spend more time alone. Journal. God shows up in our circumstances, and he shows up. And if you need to heal, or if you need to process trauma, or if you need to grow closer to him, whatever it is, just we have to make space for him, just like we make space for other people in our life.
That's right. And basically, you turn around 180 degrees when you find God and you want to follow him. You've got to turn away from what the world says. The world says you've got to do this. God says, no, you've got to go the opposite direction.
Right.
And that doesn't make sense to most people. But when
It didn't make sense to me in the beginning.
It didn't make sense to you. No, there you go. So you had a reason to try it and test it and have a go.
I did a lot of researching. I wouldn't say that I tested God, but I definitely knew he was trying to help me. And it was very difficult for me to agree to submit to him in the way that I needed to heal. I didn't that wasn't easy for me. That part of the journey was very hard because I had to give up things, and I had to learn how to forgive people that hurt me, and I had to learn how to love people unconditionally that had hurt me. And I started implementing the commandments, and I started doing all these things, and most of it was pretty seamless, and it wasn't difficult. It's not hard to be a good person, but at the same time, it was difficult for me to forgive people and to love unconditionally and to really see people the way God sees us. But once I got it, I couldn't imagine going back to the way I used to be because I was rigid and cold, and I allowed past hurts to affect my everyday life. And I'm a much happier person now. I'm a very complete person on the inside. And before I wasn't. I had a lot of brokenness.
Well, you wouldn't know now that you have a brain injury or had a brain. You can't tell at all.
Thank you. Thank you.
So your healing is pretty close to complete.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and have you got anything sort of poignant that you would like to leave with our viewers? Something on your heart that you feel?
Well, I guess the only thing I'd want to leave anybody with is, if, I know this kind of sounds crazy, but I mean, if your brain ever quits on you, or you find yourself in a place that you can't recover from with doctor's help or whatnot, turn to God, turn to Jesus, and implement his teachings, and the road will lead you home in more ways than one.
I think that's pretty good advice because I see this world the way it is now. People have lost the real meaning of life, and a lot of people have lost themselves. And
Right.
that's why we have a lot of mental health problems. I think that's one of the reasons anyway. But if they could be grounded in what the truth is, make a whole lot of difference.
It really does. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for being on my show.
Well, thank
Uh,
you for having me.
so, how can people get in touch with you if they want to chat with you about
Yeah, so I have a website. It's www.gracekinginfo.com. And I have a book as well. It's called A Stroke of Grace, and it's out on Amazon and many other platforms, but I don't have time to say all the platforms, but you can Google it. The journey, my book is about my journey with God over the last 8 years and what that was like working with Him. And the information on the website, I'm the lead theologian for Grace King Info. So you can always send me an email if you have any questions, or if you need help getting your walk going with the Lord, or if you want or if you have questions about healing the brain or anything like that. I'll be happy to help.
All right, that's awesome. And I really appreciate you being on my show.
Well, thank you
Uh,
for having me.
I think people need a spiritual anchor because that's a part of them that they quite often miss. So I
Absolutely.
appreciate you being here to share your story.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to edit this now because